Forget everything you think you know about the Trojan War. Forget the simple romance of Paris and Helena. Forget the idea of a just war fought purely for honor. The story we've been told, the one Hollywood immortalized with glorious duels at sunset, is, at best, a convenient half-truth. For centuries, we've been led to believe in a fairy tale about passion, but the truth is much darker, more cynical, and brutally economical. We've been taught to admire heroes who, in reality, committed war crimes that would make modern villains blush. We believe the story ends with a wooden horse, but that's not even the main point. Today, we'll tear away the veil of myth. We'll expose the truth behind the legend, divine politics, greed for control of trade routes, and wounded pride. Relaunch the 1,000 ships. What would you do if the gods conspired to ruin your life before you were even born? How did the fury of a single man Achilles nearly destroy his own army? And here lies the greatest, most counterintuitive truth of all, the one that changes everything. The victors of the Trojan War lost. The victory was so savage, so full of sacrilege, that it cursed the victors and led to their own civilization's total collapse, plunging the world into a dark age that lasted 400 years. This isn't a love story. It's the story of how an entire era of humanity went up in flames. If you're tired of superficial versions and want the full story with all the glory, cunning, and brutality, you're in the right place. Help us spread knowledge and keep these true sagas alive. Subscribe to the channel, click like now so more people see this, and activate the bell so you don't miss a single episode. And we want to know, which city or country are you watching from? Also, leave a comment about another great human story you'd like to see dissected here. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in a world of bronze, power, and a prophecy that terrified Zeus himself. Before history was chiseled in stone and legends sung by bards, there was a vibrant, interconnected world forged in bronze, at the end of the Bronze Age, around 1250 BC. This is not a world of unified nations as we know them, but a pulsating Mediterranean. A mosaic of empires and palace fortresses that vied fiercely for control of land, sea, and above all, the trade routes that were the arteries of civilization itself. To the south, the Egypt of the pharaohs, immeasurable in its wealth and antiquity, extended its influence. To the east, in central Anatolia, the Hittite Empire, a bureaucratic and military powerhouse, ruled with an iron fist and kept meticulous archives on clay tablets. And to the west, spread across the Greek mainland and the Aegean islands, flourished a civilization of warriors and traders, the Mycenaeans. Centuries later, Homer would call them Achaeans, Danaans, or Argives. They were the lords of Mycene, rich in gold, Tyrans, strong-walled, and Pylos, the sandy. They were a palace culture, ruled by a warrior king, Wainax, who presided over a rigidly hierarchical society. Their scribes used a script, linear B, not for poetry, but for inventories. How many amphorae of oil? How many copper ingots? How many armed men and how many chariots were ready for war? They were builders of monumental beehive tombs, such as the treasury of Atreus, and their warriors dressed in bronze plate armor, like the panoply of Dendra, and wore fearsome helmets adorned with boar's tusks. Mycenaean power was synonymous with naval power. Their round-hulled ships, propelled by oars and square sails, were part merchant, part pirate, and they plied the Mediterranean in search of the two essential ingredients of their age, copper, from places like Cyprus, and tin, a rare metal that traveled incredibly long routes, perhaps from Afghanistan or Cornwall. And this is where fate meets geography. The Mycenaean economy to thrive, it needed access. The most vital access was to the Black Sea, the Euxine point, from which came precious grains, gold, and perhaps tin itself. But to get there, all Aegean shipping was forced to pass through a single, narrow choke point, what we now call the Dardanelles. And guarding the entrance to this strait, perched like an eagle on a strategic hill, the web of fate that would ensnare Troy was not woven by mortal hands. Its first threads were pulled on Olympus itself, amid the politics and fears of the immortal gods. At the center of this cosmic intrigue stood Thetis, the most beautiful of the Nereids, the sea nymphs. Her grace was such that she attracted the desire of the two most powerful brothers in the pantheon, Zeus, the king of the gods, and Poseidon, the lord of the seas. Both courted her, and a divine alliance seemed imminent. But a shadow loomed over this desire, a dark prophecy, perhaps whispered by Prometheus, the titan who knew the secrets of the future, or by Themis, the goddess of divine law. The prophecy was simple, yet devastating. The son born of Thetis would, by destiny, be greater than his father, or Poseidon. This would mean a rival who could command the seas with greater fury. But for Zeus, it was an echo of his own bloody past. Zeus had only become king by leading a rebellion and dethroning his father, the titan Cronus. And Cronus, in turn, had seized power by mutilating Jurfarth, Uranus. Zeus's rule was based on power, but sustained by a paranoid fear that the cycle of history would repeat itself. This prophecy was not a warning. It was a death sentence for his reign. A son of Thetis who was greater than Zeus would be the end of Olympus as he knew it. Immediately, all the desires Zeus and Poseidon felt for Thetis soured, turning into political fear. The nymph became a problem to be solved, a cosmic threat that needed to be neutralized. The solution was an act of cynical restraint. If Thetis were forced to marry a mortal, the prophecy would be harmlessly fulfilled. The son would, indeed, be greater than his mortal father, but would remain just that, a mortal. He might become the greatest hero of his generation, but he would never be a threat to the throne of Olympus. The chosen groom was Peleus, king of Phthia, and a renowned hero who had ridden with the Argonauts. He was worthy enough for a divine bride, but conveniently mortal to nullify the threat. Thetis did not accept this fate passively. Legend has it that she resisted Peleus's capture with fury, using her nymphal powers to metamorphose, turning herself into fire, water, a lioness, or a serpent. But Peleus, instructed by the gods, seized her and would not let go, resisting until she exhausted herself and returned to her divine form, defeated. This was not a marriage of love. It was a union forced by the politics of divine fear. It was a desperate attempt by Zeus to control his own destiny, to lock the future. Little did he know that in trying to avert a threat to his throne, he was actually forging the weapon that would destroy an entire mortal kingdom. The son of this union, the product of prophecy and fear, would be named Achilles. To celebrate this forced union and seal the solution to Thetis's problem, the gods held a monumental wedding feast. It was the social event of the cosmos, held in the caves of Mount Pelion in Thessaly. All the gods, demigods, nymphs, and nature spirits were invited. Nectar and ambrosia abounded. The muses sang, and Apollo played his lyre. It was meant to be a display of harmony, a temporary truce from the intrigues of Olympus. But in their attempt to ensure perfection, the gods made a fatal miscalculation. They omitted one name from the guest list, Eris, the goddess of discord. Eris was the embodiment of chaos, strife, and conflict. No one wanted her at a celebration of unity, for her very presence was a poison to harmony. But being scorned was not something Eris would accept. The offense was profound. If the gods wanted to ignore discord, she would show them that discord cannot be ignored. It is a fundamental force of the universe. Furious, she appeared unannounced at the threshold of the feast. She neither shouted nor attacked. Her method was far more subtle and therefore infinitely more destructive. With a disdainful smile, she simply rolled an object into the center of the hall, between the feet of the celebrating gods, an apple of pure gold, taken, some say, from the garden of the Hesperides. On it was engraved a single word in Greek, slopingly to the beautiful para Amaze Bela. The music stopped. The conversation ceased. What had been a party became a courtroom. The apple, glistening on the ground, was a ticking time bomb. Who would dare pick it up? Almost instantly, 3 of the most powerful goddesses of Olympus stepped forward to claim the prize. The first was Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus. Her claim was based on majesty, power, and position. As queen, beauty was her birthright. The second was Athena, the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and war. Her claim was to austere beauty, a brilliant mind, and martial skill. She represented the beauty of strategic perfection. The third was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, passion, and desire. Her claim was absolute. She wraithed the very essence of beauty and carnal attraction. The dispute became fierce. None of the 3 would yield, and the other gods, terrified, refused to take sides. The rivalry threatened to split Olympus in 2. The banquet hall, meant to celebrate the fulfillment of a prophecy, became the cradle of a new conflict, born of divine vanity. Eris's apple had worked perfectly, the goddess of discord having planted her seed. disappeared into the shadows, leaving the perfect gods to deal with the chaos she had created. The fate of Troy in that moment was sealed, not by an army, but by a dispute over beauty. The contest for the golden apple placed Zeus in an impossible political position. The three competitors were his wife, Hera, and his two daughters, Athena and Aphrodite. Choosing one guaranteed the eternal hatred of the other two. Wise enough to recognize a no-win game, Zeus used his royal cunning. He abstained. He declared that such a trial was beyond his jurisdiction, and that only a mortal, known for his impartiality and aesthetic sense, could resolve the matter. The chosen judge was a young man named Paris, who lived as a shepherd on Mount Ida, near Troy. What Zeus perhaps didn't know, or chose to ignore, was that this shepherd was actually Alexander, a Trojan prince. Paris was the son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba. However, before his birth, Hecuba dreamed that she gave birth not to a baby, but to a flaming torch that set the entire city ablaze. Seers such as Aesicus interpreted the nightmare as a dire prophecy. The baby would be the ruin of Troy. Terrified, Priam ordered the child killed. The servant in charge, however, lacked the courage and instead abandoned Paris on Mount Ida, where he was found and raised by shepherds growing up in complete ignorance of his royal blood, known only for his remarkable beauty and his fair judgment in local disputes. It was to this man, isolated from the world, that Hermes, the messenger of the gods, descended, bringing with him the three rival goddesses and the golden apple. Hermes explained the task. Paris, at first terrified at being forced to judge deities, tried to refuse, but Zeus's command was absolute. What followed was not a beauty trial, but an auction of bribes. Each goddess, desperate to win, offered Paris a prize that reflected her power. Hera, haughty, was the first. She offered him political power. "Choose me," she declared, "and I will make you king of all Asia and Europe, the mightiest man on earth." Then Athena, her gray eyes shining with intensity, offered him military glory and wisdom. "Choose me, and you will never lose a battle. I will make you the wisest and most feared warrior who ever lived." Finally, Aphrodite approached. She didn't offer empires or victories. She offered the young shepherd something far more fundamental. She promised him love, not just any love, but the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris, a man who had grown up far from the ambitions of politics and war, a man driven more by passion than strategy, didn't hesitate. He rejected power over men and glory over armies. He chose desire. He handed the golden apple to Aphrodite. In that instant, he earned the eternal gratitude of the goddess of love and simultaneously sealed the fate of his hometown. Hera and Athena, humiliated and consumed by divine resentment, turned against Paris. And their hatred would not only be against the man, but against his entire people. From that moment on, the destruction of Troy became the personal priority of two of Olympus's most ruthless goddesses. Paris's choice reverberated from Mount Ida to Olympus. Aphrodite, triumphant, held the golden apple, proof of her supremacy. Hera and Athena departed, shrouded in a cloud of silent fury, a silence that promised a terrible and patient revenge. Aphrodite's first act as Paris's patron was to ensure the young shepherd regained his rightful place. She orchestrated events so that Paris would travel to the city of Troy and participate in funeral games held in honor of the prince everyone believed dead himself. There his skill and grace, perhaps enhanced by the goddess, were so impressive that he defeated his own brothers, including the noble Hector. It was then that his sister, Cassandra, a prophetess cursed by Apollo to always see the truth but never be believed, recognized him. She ran to him, screaming in horror, clinging to the temple pillars. "Stop him! He is the torch. He is the fire that will burn Troy to the ground." But as the curse decreed, no one heeded her. King Priam and Queen Hecuba, seeing the son they had lost so long ago, were overcome with joy. The terrible prophecy of his birth was forgotten, swept away by the thrill of reunion. Paris was welcomed back to the palace, not as a shepherd, but as a Trojan prince. The ruin of the city was now safe within its impenetrable walls. With Paris properly installed, Aphrodite proceeded to fulfill the most crucial part of her promise. She identified the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, Queen of Sparta. There were, however, two monumental problems. First, Helen was the daughter of Zeus, who had seduced her mother, Leda, in the form of a swan, and her beauty was therefore of divine origin. Second, she was married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. But for the goddess of love, a mortal husband was a mere inconvenience. The promise was not only that Peristhe believe Helena, but that Howold have. Aphrodite began to weave her web, inspiring in Paris a consuming desire to travel to Sparta and simultaneously preparing Helen's heart for his arrival. Under the guise of a diplomatic mission, Paris convinced his father, Priam, to finance the construction of a fleet. Again, the Trojan seers protested. Helenus, Cassandra's twin brother and also a prophet, predicted that the ships would bring calamity back home. But Priam, perhaps influenced by Aphrodite's will or simply blinded by the pride of his newly recovered son, authorized the voyage. Paris sailed for Sparta. What he didn't know was that Helen was not just a beautiful woman. She was the nexus of one of the most dangerous political oaths ever sworn, an oath that bound all the great kings of Greece. Aphrodite's promise was not just a gift of love. It was the perfect bait for a trap that would plunge the known world into the greatest war of its age. The Trojan fleet, with its purple sails and carved prows, cut through the Aegean. This was no simple voyage. It was a royal entourage burdened with the weight of Aphrodite's will and shadowed by Cassandra's unheeded warnings. Paris, now reinstated as a prince, sailed not as a conqueror but as a diplomat, and, secretly, as a man seeking a prize promised by a goddess. The destination was Sparta, the austere and militaristic heart of Laconia, a kingdom that could not be more different from the opulent and commercial Troy. Sparta's walls were not of stone, it was said, but rather the chests of its warriors. It was a place of rigid discipline, ruled by King Menelaus, brother of the powerful Agamemnon. Menelaus received the Trojan delegation not with suspicion, but with the absolute formality dictated by the most sacred law of Greek civilization, xenia, the sacred duty of hospitality. In a world without embassies or hotels, xenios, the code that held society together. A host was supposed to welcome a stranger, bathe him, feed him, and offer him shelter, without even asking his name until the guest was satisfied. Breaking this law was sacrilege, a direct offense against Zeus. Geniuses, the protector of the guests. Paris, the Trojan prince, was received at the palace of Menelaus, and a great banquet was held in his honor. It was there, in Sparta's main hall, that the two axes of fate collided. Paris, described by poets as the most beautiful man among mortals, looked up, and then she entered. Helen. She was not merely a queen, she was an event. Daughter of Zeus and Leda, her beauty was not entirely human. It had the disturbing glow of the divine, a grace that was said to make men forget their words and their loyalties. The instant Paris's eyes met Helen's, Aphrodite's promise on Mount Ida was activated. It was not mere attraction, it was a divine compulsion, a fire lit by the goddess of love. The air in the hall crackled with an inevitability only the two of them could sense. The days turned into a week of feasting and hunting. Paris, with his oriental charm and luxurious clothing, was an exotic figure in the Spartan court. Then, fate intervened with almost deliberate convenience. Menelaus was informed that his grandfather, Catreus, had died in Crete. The funeral duty was urgent. Demonstrating the height of trust and hospitality, Menelaus departed for Crete, leaving his home, his treasure, and his wife in the care of his honored guest, the Prince of Troy. He placed the fox in charge of guarding the henhouse, but he did so under the sacred protection of Zeus himself. He could not imagine that a guest, a prince of an allied kingdom, would commit the most unthinkable act of treason. With Menelaus away, sailing to Crete, the palace of Sparta fell under Aphrodite's spell. The goddess, having orchestrated every step thus far, now reaped her reward. What exactly happened in those days is the central question of the legend, shrouded in poetic mystery and ancient propaganda. Was it a violent abduction, a calculated seduction, or a voluntary escape? Iliad Homer's poem is subtle, referring to Helen with a mixture of guilt and fatalism. Later poets such as Sappho would be more direct, suggesting that Helen went willingly. Neither her daughter nor her dear parents, she remembered, as Aphrodite drove her mad with love. Others, trying to save Greek honor, would insist that she was a passive victim, dragged against her will. The most likely and dramatically potent version is a mixture of both. An unhappy woman, married for political reasons, confronted with the most handsome man in the world, and driven by a divine force she was powerless to resist. Regardless of Helen's disposition, Paris's action was a catastrophic violation of Xenia. He was not just an adulterer, he was a thief who desecrated his host's home. The crime was not just one of passion. In an act of greed that sealed through her accident beyond any marital dispute. Paris didn't just take Helen. He plundered Menelaus's coffers, taking with him a vast portion of the Spartan treasure. Gold, silver, fine cups, and perhaps even the palace servants. He robbed his host of his honor and then stole his wealth. Under cover of night, Paris, Helen, and the stolen treasure rushed to their ships and set sail for Troy. The return journey was not straightforward. Some traditions, notably the historian Herodotus, claim that contrary winds, perhaps sent by an angry Hera, deflected them from their course. They stopped in Sidon, Phoenicia, where Paris plundered even more riches, and in Cyprus, before finally reaching the ports of Troy. When Paris's ship landed, it brought not only a new wife and stolen gold, it brought ruin. The reaction in Troy was shock and division. Cassandra, of course, tore her clothes, crying that the plague had arrived, that the woman disembarking was the fire that would consume their towers. Hector, Paris's older brother and the city's defender, was furious. He saw the act for what it was, a despicable breach of honor that invited just retaliation. He would have advocated for Helen's immediate return, but old King Priam, blinded by love for his recently recovered son and perhaps dazzled by Helen's divine beauty, wavered. He made the fatal mistake of condoning his son's crime. He accepted Helen within his walls. At that moment, Troy's fate was sealed. When Menelaus returned from Crete, he found a silent palace. His wife's absence could have been explained, but the empty coffers and missing servants told the full story of betrayal. His grief quickly turned to icy, utter fury. He had not only been betrayed as a husband, he had been humiliated as a king, and his authority had been publicly destroyed by the guest he had honored. The violation of Oceaniawas, an attack on the order of the cosmos, and honor always of Menelaus exacted revenge on an unprecedented scale. He not only wanted his wife back, he wanted the city that sheltered her reduced to ashes. He immediately traveled to Mycenae, the Cyclopean walled citadel, to seek his brother, Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece. But Agamemnon and Menelaus didn't just need to ask for favors. They had a legal weapon, an iron contract forged years earlier, known as the Oath of Tyndareus. To understand war, one must understand this oath. Years earlier, Helen was still an unmarried princess in Sparta, under the guardianship of her mortal father, King Tyndareus. Her beauty was so legendary that all the unmarried kings and heroes of Greece, Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes, Idomeneus, Philoctetes, traveled to Sparta to ask for her hand in marriage. The competition was so fierce that Tyndareus found himself in an impossible situation. He knew that whoever he chose as his son-in-law, all the other rejected suitors would become his mortal enemies. He feared they would unite and destroy his kingdom. It was the cunning Odysseus, king of Ithaca, who provided the solution. In exchange for Tyndareus' support in marrying his niece, Penelope, Odysseus proposed that Tyndareus make all the suitors swear a solemn vow. Before the groom was chosen, they were all to swear to uphold Tyndareus' choice, and most importantly, to swear that if any man attempted to take Helen away, they would all join in arms to bring the culprit to justice and retrieve Helen. Desperate to win her hand, and perhaps underestimating the future weight of their words, all the heroes of Greece agreed. They made solemn sacrifices, perhaps over the parts of a severed horse, binding their souls to this pact. Tyndareus then wisely chose the wealthy and politically secure Menelaus. Now, years later, that forgotten promise was invoked. Menelaus and Agamemnon sent heralds to every corner of Greece, from Ithaca to Crete, from Salamis to Argos. The message was not a request for alliance. It was a legal and religious summons. The kings of Greece were bound by their own words. The Oath of Tyndareus was the legal engine Agamemnon needed to turn a domestic dispute into a world war. While Menelaus' grief was visceral and personal, his brother Agamemnon's reaction was calculated and strategic. As king of Mycenae, the gold-rich, Agamemnon was the most powerful Wainax among the Achaeans, a man whose ambition was as vast as his treasure. He saw Paris's betrayal not as an insult to his family, but as the opportunity of a lifetime. Helen's abduction was not the cause of the war. It was the perfect pretext. For years, Agamemnon and the other Mycenaean kings had looked eastward with greed. As detailed at the outset, Troy was the guardian of the Straits, a geographic tollgate that controlled access to the lucrative Black Sea trade. Priam's city was a commercial rival, a stronghold that prevented the full expansion of Mycenaean power. For generations, they had coveted its walls, its horses, and its gold. But an unprovoked attack would be difficult to justify. Now Paris had handed over to Agamemnon through her accidenton a silver platter. The Oath of Tyndareus provided the legal framework to coerce other kings to follow it. Violation of the Sheniac provided the moral high ground, and the abduction of the world's most beautiful woman provided the poetic propaganda, a story of tarnished honor and righteous justice that could unite the common soldiers. Agamemnon used the oath not only to help his brother, but to establish himself as the king of kings, the Anaxandron, lord of men. This would be the first and last time in the heroic age that all the disparate kingdoms of Greece would unite under a single banner, and that banner would be his. The logistics of such an undertaking were colossal. The catalogue of ships in Book 2 of the Iliad, which may echo an authentic Bronze Age military record, lists 29 contingents of 1,186 ships. This may be a poetic exaggeration, but it captures the scale of the mobilization. Agamemnon was not assembling a strike force, he was assembling a nation. From Crete, King Idomeneus brought his ships. From Argos, the mighty Diomedes. From Salamis, the giant Ajax. And from Pylos, the wise and elderly King Nestor. Each king had his own ambitions and his own reasons, but all were bound by the oath and the overwhelming political pressure of Agamemnon. The leader of Mycene was willing to risk everything, for the reward was not only the recovery of Helen, but the sack of the richest city in the Aegean, and the establishment of a unified Achaean empire. War, for him, was about economics and legacy. The seeds of the internal conflict that would nearly destroy the Greek army 10 years later, the contest between Agamemnon and Achilles, were planted here, in the tension between enforced loyalty and royal ambition. As the kings and heroes of Greece began to gather, answering Agamemnon's call, not all did so willingly. Nowhere was this reluctance stronger than on the small, rocky island of Ithaca. Its king, Odysseus, was different from the others. He was known not for his brute strength, like Ajax, or for his divine lineage, like Achilles, but for his mind, hispat, or cunning intelligence. Odysseus had indeed sworn the Oath of Tyndareus years earlier, but he had done so reluctantly. He had engineered it, after all. Now he had everything he had ever wanted: his clever wife Penelope, and crucially, a newborn son, Telemachus. Furthermore, an oracle had given him a grim warning. If he went to Troy, he would return only 20 years later, alone, disguised as a beggar, and find his home in disgrace. Odysseus had no desire to trade his kingdom and family for a decade of war for another man's adulterous affair. When Agamemnon's heralds, including Menelaus and an equally cunning hero named Palamedes, landed on Ithaca, they found a bizarre scene. The king of Ithaca stood on the beach, completely naked, plowing the sand. But his plow wasn't pulled by 2 oxen. It was pulled by an ox and a donkey, an unbalanced and absurd combination. For instead of sowing grain, Odysseus was throwing handfuls of salt onto the barren furrows. He was feigning madness, hoping the heralds would deem him unfit for war and leave him and his family alone. Menelaus and the others were perplexed, but Palamedes, a rival inventor and strategist, remained unconvinced. He saw the performance for what it was, a trick. Determined to expose the deception, Palamedes decided to force the cunning king's hand with an act of calculated cruelty. He took the infant Telemachus from Penelope's arms, walked to the beach, and placed the child directly in the path of the advancing plow. Odysseus was faced with an impossible dilemma: maintain his disguise and kill his only son, or reveal his sanity. In a second, the deception collapsed. Odysseus brought the plow to a sudden halt, deflecting the blade from the child and catching his son. Palamedes looked at him, his point proven. Odysseus was perfectly sane, and therefore bound by the oath. "War awaits you, king of Ithaca," Palamedes reportedly said. Odysseus, furious at being tricked and forced to leave his home, agreed to join the expedition. But he never forgave Palamedes, and this grudge would have deadly consequences years later on the shores of Troy. Stories like this about the complexities of loyalty and destiny are why we love mythology. If you're also fascinated by these epic tullies and want to ensure you don't miss a single chapter of this journey, click subscribe and activate the bell. Supporting this channel is supporting the spread of knowledge. Every like and share helps bring these incredible stories to more people. It's a way to keep the memory of these heroes alive. And we want to hear from you. Which character from the Trojan War do you most admire? Or perhaps there's another story from another time or place that you'd like to see told here. Leave your suggestion in the comments. Finally, tell us which city and country you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far these legends traveled. Odysseus was now trapped, forced to prepare his ships for a war he knew would define and destroy his life. While Odysseus was forced to join the war against his will, another crucial hero was entirely absent. Agamemnon and the Greek kings knew from the prophet Calchas that victory at Troy was impossible without the greatest living warrior, Achilles. But Achilles had disappeared. His mother, the sea nymph Thetis, knew full well her son's fate. The prophecy she had received was twofold and dire. Achilles could choose to live a long, peaceful, and obscure life, dying of old age in his homeland of Phthia. Or he could go to Troy, gaining immortal fame, Kleos, and die young on the battlefield. For Thetis, who had been forced to marry a mortal and give birth to a son destined to die, the choice was obvious. Eternal fame meant nothing to her. She only wanted to save her son. To thwart fate, Thetis took drastic measures. When Achilles was a child, she attempted to burn away his mortality by holding him over the sacred fire, but was stopped by her husband Peleus. In another, more famous and later version, she plunged him into the waters of the river Styx in the underworld, rendering his entire body invulnerable except for the heel by which she held him. Now, with war approaching, she hid him. She sent the young hero to the island kingdom of Scyros, ruled by King Lycomedes. There, Achilles, the most virile of warriors, was forced to live disguised as one of the king's daughters, dressed in women's clothing. Learning to weave and dance, and growing his hair long, he was called Pyrrha the Redhead, and lived among the princesses hidden in plain sight. However, the same prophecy that guided Thetis also guided the Greeks. Calchas, the seer, informed Agamemnon that Achilles was hiding in Cyrus. The challenge was to find and convince him. For a task that required brute strength and supreme cunning, Agamemnon sent the two men who could succeed, Odysseus and Diomedes. The heroes arrived in Cyrus disguised as traveling merchants. They were welcomed into Lycomedes' palace and allowed to display their wares to the king's daughters. The room filled with silks, jewels, and perfumes. The princesses rushed to the fine fabrics in amazement, but Odysseus, the master of human psychology, had hidden a bait among the women's items. Among the silks, he placed a magnificent sword, a polished shield, and an ash spear. As the women examined the jewels, Pyrrha, Achilles, couldn't take his eyes off the weapons. His nature, long suppressed, felt the call of bronze. Sensing this, Odysseus executed the final part of his plan. He ordered one of his men outside to blow a war trumpet and shout as if the palace were under attack. The reaction was instantaneous. The princesses screamed and ran for cover. Achilles, in pure reflex, tore off his feminine gown, grabbed his sword and shield, and assumed a fighting stance, ready to face the unseen enemy. Odysseus simply smiled and walked toward him. Fate has found you, son of Peleus. Troy awaits you. The farce was over. For Achilles, the choice between a long and obscure life or a short and glorious one was never really a choice. He was a warrior at heart. He left Cyrus, leaving behind one of the princesses, Didamia, pregnant with his son, Neoptolemus, and joined the Greek fleet, bringing with him his elite warriors, the Myrmidons. Greece's deadliest weapon was now aimed at Troy, with Odysseus coerced and Achilles recruited. The greatest armada the world had ever seen was finally assembled. Thousands of soldiers and Greece's greatest heroes converged on the port of Aulis in Boeotia. The catalogue of ships describes a force of mythic proportions. Sharp, proud black ships filled the vast bay, their masts resembling a ravaged forest. There was an air of excitement, arrogance, and certainty. They were the Achaeans, favored by the gods, led by the mighty Agamemnon, about to launch a just war to punish an unforgivable act of treason. Greek honor would be avenged, and the gold of Troy would be theirs. They sacrificed to the gods. An omen seemed favorable, a serpent devouring 9 sparrows, interpreted by Calchas as 9 years of war, followed by victory in the 10th. They were ready. But then, nothing happened. The ships, laden with men and horses, were ready to set sail. The captains gave the order, but the winds did not come. What had been a gentle breeze became silence, and the silence became a deathly calm. The air grew still. The sea at Aulis, usually bustling, became a still pane of glass. Days turned into weeks. The sun beat down on the men trapped on the ships. Fresh water became scarce. Food rotted in the holds. Morale, once sky-high, plummeted. The army, bored and restless, began to murmur. Disease began to spread through the overcrowded camp. The greatest war machine ever assembled was being defeated not by an enemy army, but by nature itself. Agamemnon, the commander-in-chief, was desperate. He consulted Calchas the seer, demanding to know which god they had offended. Calchas hesitated, for the truth was dangerous. Finally, with the promise of Achilles' protection, the prophet revealed the cause. The wrath was that of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, the mistress of wild animals, and the eternal virgin. The reason for the offense varies in legend. Some say that Agamemnon, in a moment of arrogance, during a hunt, killed a doe sacred to Artemis, and boasted, saying, "Not even Artemis herself could have made a better shot." Others say it was an older sin, a broken promise by his father Atreus, who had sworn to sacrifice the best lamb in his flock to the goddess, but upon finding a lamb with golden fleece, he hid it. The lull was the goddess's revenge. The Greek army would not sail for Troy. They would rot in Aulis, their great expedition ending in humiliating failure, unless the price demanded by Artemis was paid. The price Artemis demanded, as revealed by Calchas, was unthinkable. The goddess wanted neither gold nor oxen, nor the long-lost golden-fleeced lamb. In exchange for Agamemnon's offense against her sacred doe, she demanded a life for a life, a blood sacrifice to pay for that blood. She demanded Agamemnon's own firstborn daughter, Princess Iphigenia. For the king of Mycenae, this was a moment of supreme crisis. He was a commander trying to hold together a disintegrating army of 1,000 ships, but he was also a father. The playwright Euripides, in his tragedy Iphigenia at Aulis, captures the king's agony. He refuses, curses the gods, curses war, and orders the army disbanded. He weeps in his tent, a broken man, choosing family over ambition. But the political pressure, personified by his brother Menelaus and the cunning Odysseus, was relentless. They argued that it was too late. The army knew of the prophecy. If Agamemnon gave up now, the soldiers, enraged by lost time and humiliation, would turn on him. They would kill him and sack Mycenae. He was no longer in control. War was a beast that, once fed, demanded to be sated. He was trapped between the destruction of his family at his own hands and the destruction of his kingdom and his life at the hands of his own army. In an agonizing reversal, Agamemnon chose power. He chose war. He chose fate over love. But how to bring Iphigenia to Aulis? She was safe in Mycenae with her mother, Clytemnestra. Neither of them would ever agree to the sacrifice. It was here that Odysseus, the man of pragmatic and terrifying solutions, intervened. They sent a false message to Clytemnestra, a brilliant and cruel lie. They told her to bring Iphigenia to Aulis not to die, but to marry. The groom would be Greece's greatest hero, Achilles himself. It was an immense honor, an alliance that would unite the two greatest houses of Greece. Proud, Clytemnestra made the journey, bringing her daughter dressed for the wedding. When she arrived in Aulis, the deception was revealed. Clytemnestra's fury was volcanic. Achilles, discovering his name had been used in such a ruse, was also enraged. Not out of love for Iphigenia, he barely knew her, but because his honor had been tarnished. He tried to defend the girl, but his own Myrmidons refused to obey him, threatening to stone him. They, too, wanted the winds. In the end, according to Euripides, it was Iphigenia herself who made the decision. Seeing that her death was the only thing that could save her father and allow the honor of Greece to be avenged, she walked voluntarily to the altar. "It is better that one man live than that 10,000 women see the light," she reportedly said, accepting her role as martyr. She was led to the altar of Artemis. Agamemnon turned his face away, unable to watch, his tears flowing as Calchas raised the sacrificial knife. As the blade descended, some versions say that Artemis, moved by pity, replaced the girl with a doe at the last second, taking Iphigenia as her priestess. But this is later consolation. The darker version, and the one Clytemnestra believed, is that the knife found its mark. Royal blood was spilled. and almost immediately a strong wind blew from the north, filling the sails of 1,000 ships. The Greek army had bought its passage to Troy with innocent blood, and in Mycenae, a heartbroken queen, Clytemnestra, began sharpening her own axe, patiently waiting 10 years for the return of the husband she now hated more than anything. But before the armies clash on the beach, before the blood of heroes stains the sand, let us leap forward in time to the decisive moment, 10 long years in the future. The scene is not a sun-swept battlefield, but a dark, artificial womb. We are inside the belly of the Trojan horse. The air is stale, heavy with the smell of sweat, leather, oil, and the pungent odor of pine resin. 30, perhaps 50, of the finest Achaean warriors are huddled together in near total darkness. Among them is Odysseus, the architect of this madness; Menelaus, who started it all; Diomedes, the great warrior; and Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, here to end the war his father started. They stand in absolute silence, each man a statue of tension. A single sound, the creak of a leather strap, a muffled cough, a gasp of fear, would mean the death of them all and the failure of a decade of war. Outside, the sounds of Trojan victory can be heard. The city, which for 10 years lived in fear of siege, is ecstatic. The Greeks have fled. The war is over. The Trojans, exhausted and credulous, celebrate. Odysseus and his men hear the drunken chants, the laughter, the cries of Troy as one. They hear the feet of the citizens dancing around their hiding place, pounding the wooden planks, marveling at the offering they have left for Athena. The contrast is torturous. Outside, the noisy liberation. Inside, the silent tension of death. Every Trojan celebration is a hammer pounding on the nerves of the hidden men. The greatest test, the most exquisite psychological test, was yet to come. As night fell and the party reached its height, the men inside the horse heard a familiar voice approaching. It was Helen. She walked around the great horse, touching its wood, and then she began to speak, but she didn't speak in her own voice. In an act of cruelty or perhaps divine curiosity, she began to perfectly imitate the voices of the wives of the Greek heroes. She called Odysseus, sounding exactly like Penelope. She called Menelaus, with her own voice from years ago. She called Diomedes, imitating his wife in Argos. It was a phantom attack. One of the heroes, Anticlus, overcome with grief and longing, was about to scream to answer the call of his wife. In a swift, brutal movement, Odysseus reached out in the darkness, grabbed the man's face, and squeezed his mouth and throat with an iron grip, stifling his scream. He held his grip mercilessly until the danger passed, nearly killing the man to save the mission. Silence reigned supreme. Outside, the celebrations subsided and the city, exhausted and drunk, finally fell asleep. Only then did Odysseus release his grip. The immediate danger had passed. But this is the desperate climax, the end of the story. To understand how the victorious Greeks were reduced to hiding inside a wooden idol, and how the Trojans, masters of their impenetrable walls, were so completely deceived, we must go back. We must return to the first day, to the bloodied beach, and to the 9 long, exhausting years of war that drove everyone to the brink of madness. The Greek fleet, driven by the sacrificial winds of Aulis, crossed the Aegean. But the war did not begin with glory. The first landing was a disaster. A prophecy stated that the first Greek to set foot on Trojan soil would be the first to die. While Odysseus cleverly hesitated, throwing his shield onto the beach and leaping upon it. It was Protesilaus of Thessaly who, in an act of courage or desperation, leaped from his ship. He was immediately shot down by Hector. The war had claimed its first hero, and the siege began. The Greeks established a vast camp on the beach between the Scamander River and the Hellespont, dragging their 1,000 ships onto the sand. And there they stayed, and stayed, and stayed. The next 9 years were not the war sung in Iliad. Homer's poem covers only a few weeks of the 10th year. The previous 9 years had been a long, brutal, and monotonous war of attrition. The reality of the siege was a strategic frustration for both sides. The Greeks were masters of the open field, but they were utterly incapable of taking the city of Troy. The walls, which legend claimed were built by Apollo and Poseidon themselves, were too high, too strong, impregnable to any siege technology the Bronze Age possessed. The Trojans, for their part, were outnumbered in the open field. Led by Hector, They were formidable warriors, but they could not risk a pitched battle that could decimate their armies. Therefore, they remained within their gates, launching occasional attacks, but for the most part, waiting. This led to a stalemate. The vast Greek army could not be sustained by sea alone. It became an occupying force, and war spread. To feed the men and pay the soldiers, the Greek heroes spent most of those 9 years not fighting Hector, but on plundering campaigns. They became Mycenaean Vikings. Odysseus invaded Thrace. Achilles led attacks on 23 allied cities of Troy. On one of these raids, he sacked Lyrnesses and placid Thebes. It was there that he captured a young woman named Briseis. It was on a similar raid that Agamemnon captured Croesus, the daughter of a priest of Apollo. Warfare became a plundering economy where honor always was measured literally by the quantity and quality of the booty gold, bronze, and, most valuable of all, women. Meanwhile, camp life became an ordeal of boredom and illness. Men who arrived young began to see gray in their beards. Nostalgia for their homes became a physical ache, and the camp's internal politics festered. It was during this time that Odysseus's grudge against Palamedes, the man who forced him to go to war, reached its boiling point. In an act of dark villainy, Odysseus allegedly forged a letter from Priam to Palamedes and hid Trojan gold in his tent. He accused him of treason, and the army, weary and looking for a scapegoat, believed the hoax. Palamedes, the inventor of dice and perhaps writing itself, was stoned to death by his fellow Greeks. Morale was at its lowest point. And if this story of intrigue and the harsh realities of siege warfare surprised you, please leave a like to support our channel. The war had become a bitter routine, and the heroes were turning against each other long before the 10th year brought the final crisis. The 10th year began with no more hope than the previous 9. The Greek camp was at an impasse, and the gods, who until then had watched with relative detachment, decided to intervene. The crisis was not initiated by a general, but by a priest. An old man named Chryses, a priest of Apollo, arrived at the Greek camp from the allied city of Troy, which had been sacked. He brought with him an infinite ransom gold, silver treasures to recover his daughter. Chryses, who had been captured and given to Agamemnon as his personal war prize, his good Chryses approached humbly, holding his god's scepter, and begged the commander-in-chief to accept the ransom and release his daughter. It was a just request, supported by the rest of the army who feared the god's wrath. But Agamemnon, the king of kings, was a man consumed by arrogance, or hubris saw the request not as a transaction, but as a challenge to his authority. He exploded in fury. He publicly humiliated the old priest, threatening him and refusing the ransom. In a speech that sealed the fate of thousands, he shouted, "May I never see you near our ships again, old man, for neither your scepter nor your god will protect you. Your daughter will not be freed. She will grow old in my house in Argos, far from you, working at the loom and coming to my bed. Go before you lose your temper." Chryses, terrified, fled. But upon reaching the silent shore, he raised his hands and prayed to Apollo, asking for vengeance for the dishonor he had suffered. Apollo heard. Consumed by divine fury, the god descended from Olympus like the night. He sat far from the ships, drew his silver bow, and the sound that followed was one of metallic terror. He loosed his arrows of pestilence upon the Achaean army. The plague was not subtle. First it struck the animals, the dogs and mules. Then it struck the men. The soldiers fell in mass, their flesh burning with fever. For 9 days, the screams of the dying filled the air, and the funeral pyres burned without ceasing, the sky darkening with the smoke of their own dead. On the 10th day, Achilles, unable to watch his army perish and inspired by the goddess Hera, took a defiant step. He called a general assembly, an act that undermined Agamemnon's authority. Before the surviving soldiers, Achilles demanded that the seer Calchas reveal the cause of the god's wrath. Calchas, the same man who had interpreted the omens at Alus, stood trembling, knowing that the truth would pit him against the most powerful man in the camp. He only agreed to speak after Achilles, the greatest warrior, swore to protect him with his spear, even if it meant protecting him from Agamemnon himself. Calchas then spoke, and his voice echoed through the camp. The plague was Agamemnon's fault. Apollo was punishing the Greeks for their king's arrogance and for dishonoring the priest Chryses. The only solution was to return Croesus immediately and without ransom. The stage was set for the conflict that would define the war. Calchas's accusation hung over the assembly like a death sentence. The plague that decimated the army was Agamemnon's direct fault. The silence that followed was broken by the king of Mycene himself, who stood up, his dark eyes shining not with remorse, but with venomous fury. He had been publicly humiliated by his seer, and all under the protection of his most powerful and arrogant soldier. He spat out his response, agreeing to return Croesus to save the army, but not without a price. If the gods were taking away his prize, his good, then he would take another to re-establish his authority, his eyes fixed on Achilles. Agamemnon declared that since Achilles had so openly defied him, he, as commander, would personally go to Achilles' tent and take his war prize, the woman Briseis. This act had nothing to do with lust. It was a brutal political calculation. In a world where honor always was visible and measured by the loot a man possessed, take Thegud off Achilles was tantamount to stripping him naked in public, declaring him a worthless subordinate. The insult was blunt and intolerable. Achilles, the fastest man in the world, the demigod, felt the blood rush to his face. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword. He was a second away from killing the commander-in-chief and destroying the Greek army from within. In this moment of absolute tension, legend has it that something supernatural occurred. The goddess Athena, patroness of heroes and fearing for the fate of the Greeks, descended from Olympus. She appeared invisible to all but Achilles and grabbed him by his blonde hair. Achilles, shocked, turned and recognized the goddess. "Restrain yourself," she reportedly ordered. "Do not use your sword. Attack him with words, for I tell you, son of Peleus, the day will come when gifts 3 times as valuable will be offered to you because of this insult." Achilles, trembling with a rage that was almost a physical force, obeyed the goddess. He thrust his sword back into its sheath, but his fury, now restrained from physical violence, exploded into words. He hurled at Agamemnon the bitterest insults of all, Iliad, calling him dog-eyed, deer-hearted, a coward who hid behind his soldiers and stole the prizes from those who truly fought. Then he took the wooden scepter by which kings swore their oaths, studded with gold. He held it up for all to see and swore the most devastating oath of war. He swore, by that dead scepter that would never sprout leaves again, that he, Achilles, son of Peleus, would never again lift his spear. He and his Myrmidons would withdraw from the battle. "And when your men are falling and dying in ranks before Hector, the man-killer," he cried, "you will remember this day. You will remember how you dishonored the best of the Achaeans, and you will tear your own heart out in remorse." He threw down his scepter and returned to his tent. The assembly had broken up. Agamemnon stubbornly sent his heralds to take Briseis. Achilles, honoring his vow, surrendered her without a physical struggle, plunging into a dark and personal grief. Stay. The wrath of Achilles had begun. He went to the beach, wept, and summoned his divine mother, Thetis. He made a terrible request of her, that she go to Zeus and beg the king of the gods to give victory to the Trojans, that the Greeks be crushed against their own ships, until his army came crawling on its knees and begging for his return. Zeus, from atop Olympus, granted Thetis's request. Bound by a long-standing debt to the sea nymph, he agreed to honor Achilles by allowing the Trojans to win. To initiate his plan, he sent a false and deceptive dream to Agamemnon. The dream, in the form of the wise Nestor, told the king that the gods had finally decided in favor of the Achaeans, and that victory would be his if he launched an all-out attack immediately. Agamemnon's arrogance, believing he could win without Achilles, was all Zeus needed. The next morning, the king of Mycene ordered the entire Greek army to form for battle. Across the plain, the Trojans and their allies did the same. For the first time in a long time, this would not be a skirmish, but an all-out war. Before the armies clashed, a moment of hope dawned. Paris, the Trojan prince who had caused the war, perhaps driven by guilt or pressure from his brother Hector, stepped forward and challenged any Greek to single combat. The victor would take Helen and the treasure, and the war would end there. Menelaus, seeing the man who had destroyed his home, accepted the challenge with fury. The duel was brief and decisive. Menelaus was a war-hardened warrior. Paris was a handsome archer. Menelaus broke his sword on Paris's helmet and grabbed him by the leather strap, dragging him through the dust toward the Greek lines. The war was about to end. But Aphrodite, Paris's patron goddess, intervened. She snapped the helmet strap, freeing him. and enveloped Paris in a divine mist, magically transporting him from the battlefield directly to her fragrant chambers in Troy, where Helen awaited him. The truce was broken, and general battle broke out. And it was a battle the Greeks were unprepared for. Without Achilles' presence on the plain, the balance of power had completely shifted. The absence of the greatest Greek hero was like a hole in the universe. On the Trojan side, Hector, the prince of Troy, the man-killer and horse-tamer, became a force of nature. He was the anchor of Troy, fighting not for glory like Achilles, but for duty, for his city, his father, his wife Andromache, and his infant son, Astyanax. Now, without Achilles to restrain him, Hector was unstoppable. He led the Trojan charge, his spear cutting through the Greek ranks. The greatest Greek heroes tried to stop him. Diomedes, in his own battle rage Arestia, even wounded two gods, Aphrodite and Ares, but even he could not stop the advance. Ajax, the giant, fought Hector until nightfall, but it was a draw. The Greeks were being pushed back, first beyond their defense lines, and then back to the wall they had built around their own ships. The climax of the Trojan attack was terrifying. Hector, looking like a god of war, picked up a huge stone that two normal men couldn't lift, and hurled it at the main gate of the Greek wall. The hinges shattered. The Trojans stormed the camp. Panic gripped the Achaeans. Agamemnon himself was wounded. Hector advanced relentlessly toward the ultimate prize, the ships. If he burned the ships, the war would be over. The Greeks would be trapped in Troy, their escape route destroyed, their army annihilated. Hector reached the ship of Protesilaus, the first man to die in the war, and shouted to his men, "Bring fire! Zeus is giving us victory. This is their end." The first flames began to lick the hull of a Greek ship. Annihilation was imminent. This level of drama and desperation, where the fate of entire nations rests on a single moment, is what makes this story timeless. If you're feeling the tension of this battle and want to see how the Greeks will escape this deadly trap, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these epic narratives with the depth they deserve. The smell of smoke and the sound of panic reached Achilles' tent. The hero was still in his self-imposed rage, impassive, but his closest companion, Patroclus, was not. Patroclus was Achilles' gentle friend, his other self. In many interpretations, he was his lover, but in Iliad, their bond is one of loyalty and affection deeper than any other in the poem. Seeing the burning ships and the slaughter of the Greeks, Patroclus rushed to Achilles, his tears flowing like a fountain of dark water. He rebuked Achilles for his cruelty, asking if he were made of stone. He implored the hero to put aside his anger and save his compatriots. Achilles, though heartbroken by the scene, was bound by his own oath and his pride wounded. He still refused to fight for Agamemnon, but he could not deny Patroclus. Seeing his friend's desperation, he offered a tragic solution, a compromise. Achilles would not fight, but Patroclus would. To give the Greeks a fighting chance, Patroclus would don Achilles' divine armor, forged by Hephaestus. The Trojans, seeing that unmistakable armor, would believe that Achilles himself had returned to the battle. Their terror would be enough to break the attack. Achilles agreed, but gave Patroclus an explicit order, a fatal warning. "Drive the Trojans away from the ships," Achilles ordered. "Save the camp. But once you do, you must turn back. Do not pursue them across the plain to the walls of Troy. Do not seek your own glory. Leave that to me, or you will take away my honor." Patroclus, elated at finally being able to act, hastily agreed. He donned his greaves, breastplate, and horsehair helmet. He picked up his spears, but left behind Achilles' ash spear, too heavy for any other mortal to wield. The Myrmidons, Achilles' elite warriors, assembled for the first time in months, shouting in joy at seeing their leader ready for battle. The Patroclia, Patroclus' battle rage, was glorious and terrible. Like a hurricane, the Myrmidons fell upon the Trojans. The effect was exactly as Achilles had predicted. The Trojans, seeing the divine armor, panicked. "Achilles!" they cried. Their morale broke. The attack on the ships faltered and turned into a desperate flight. Patroclus was magnificent. He looked like a god, killing dozens, including one of Troy's greatest allies, Sarpedon, a son of Zeus himself. Patroclus saved the ships. He had accomplished his mission. But then, in a moment of the blind madness sent by the gods, he forgot Achilles' warning. Drunk with victory, he looked at the walls of Troy and decided he could end the war single-handedly. He led the pursuit against the fleeing Trojans. It was his final act. The gods would not allow a lesser hero to take the glory destined for Achilles. When Patroclus attempted to scale the walls of Troy, the god Apollo himself, the city's protector, pushed him back. Apollo, shrouded in mist, approached Patroclus and struck him in the back with the palm of his hand. The divine blow sent Achilles' armor flying into the air. His helmet rolled in the dust, the first time that helmet had touched the ground. Disarmed, stunned, and exposed, Patroclus was struck in the back by a young Trojan named Euphorbos. Hector, seeing the wounded and staggering Greek hero, advanced and delivered the final blow, running Patroclus through with his spear. As Hector gloated over the body, Patroclus, with his dying breath, uttered a prophecy. "You boast, Hector, but it was Apollo and fate that killed me. You were only the third. And hear me now, your own death is near at the hands of great Achilles." Hector then stripped Patroclus's body of Achilles' armor and donned it, an act of triumph that would seal his own fate. The battle for Patroclus's armor and body intensified, a vortex of violence swirling around the fallen hero's remains. Meanwhile, in the safety of the camp, Achilles remained in his tent, oblivious. He watched the smoke and chaos from a distance, perhaps wondering why Patroclus was taking so long to return. It was Antilochus, the son of the wise Nestor, who ran from the battlefield, his legs driven by horror. He burst into Achilles' tent, breathless, his face streaked with dust and tears. The words he spoke were the simplest and most terrible. "Son of Peleus, I must bring you news I wish were not true. Patroclus has fallen. Hector has killed him, and they are fighting over his naked body, for Hector has his armor." Achilles' world ended. His reaction was not that of a soldier, but that of a wounded animal. A terrible, inhuman scream tore from his throat, a sound so piercing and filled with pain that his mother, Thetis, heard it from the depths of the ocean. He fell to the ground, tearing his clothes. With both hands he scooped up the soot and ash from the fire and poured it over his head and face, soiling his beautiful figure. He lay sprawled in the dust, tearing at his own hair. The man who had been defined by or against Agamemnon was now defined by a pain that eclipsed the entire universe. His myrmidons wept around him, and Antilochus himself held Achilles' wrists, fearing that the hero, in his despair, would turn a blade against himself. Thetis, the divine mother, rose from the waters with her Nereid sisters, drawn by her son's lament. She found him in the dust, cradling his head. She could not save him from his fate, only witness it. "My son," she cried, "why do you suffer? That wish you made to Zeus has been granted. The Greeks were crushed against the ships and saw they needed you." Achilles, his voice choked with ash and sobs, replied, and his words marked the turning point of the Iliad. "Mother, all this is nothing. What good is it to me, now that my friend is dead? Patroclus, whom I honored above all others, whom I loved as myself, I have lost him. Hector killed him and stripped him of my armor, my glory. I no longer have the will to live among men, unless I can first make Hector pay, unless I can plunge my spear into his throat and take his life in exchange for the one he stole." Thetis' heart froze, for she knew what this meant. "If you do this, my son," she whispered, "your own fate is sealed. The prophecy is clear. Soon after Hector's death will come yours." Achilles' response was the choice that made him immortal. He looked at his mother, his eyes no longer filled with tears, but with a hollow, terrible calm. "Then let me die," he said. "Let me die right now, for I have failed. I was not there to protect my friend. I, the best of the Achaeans, sat in my ships, a dead weight on the earth, while he died. My dispute with Agamemnon, it was childish folly. It is over. My sole purpose now is to find the man who killed my friend. I will kill him, and then I will accept my own end, whenever Zeus and the other gods choose to send him." The old fury had drained away, replaced by something far colder and more lethal, the acceptance of his own death, in the service of a singular revenge. The world's greatest hero was now also its most dangerous man. The only obstacle, he had no armor. With Achilles' decision made, Thetis' grief turned to resigned acceptance. She could not save her son from death, but she could ensure he died in unparalleled glory. He needed armor worthy of his fury and his destiny. "Do not go into battle yet, my son," she commanded. "I will travel to Olympus, to the lame god Hephaestus. He owes me a favor. At dawn, I will bring him armor such as no mortal has ever worn." Thetis took off like a falcon, soaring through the sky toward the abode of the gods. She found Hephaestus in his volcanic workshop, sweating, working on his automated bellows. The smith god greeted her with genuine joy. "Why do you honor me, Thetis?" he asked. "You rarely visit." He was grateful to her. When his own mother, Hera, disgusted by his deformity, threw him from Olympus, it was Thetis and Eurynomi who took him in and raised him in a sea cave. Thetis, weeping, told him the story. Her son's pride, his dead friend, his stolen armor, and the fate that now approached. Hephaestus's heart was moved. "I cannot save you from death, noble Thetis," he said, "but I can give you armor that will make all who see it marvel." He went to his anvil. 20 bellows blew fire at his command. He threw bronze, tin, silver, and gold into the furnace. First, he forged the shield. And this shield, described in hundreds of verses by Homer, is perhaps the greatest literary work of antiquity. It was not just a piece of defense, it was a microcosm of human existence itself, the world Achilles was about to leave behind. In the center, Hephaestus forged the earth, sky, and sea, the tireless sun and the full moon, along with all the constellations, the Pleiades, the Hyades, mighty Orion, and the Bear, which watches over Orion and is the only one that never bathes in the ocean. Around this, he created 2 mortal cities. The first was a city at peace. There were weddings, with brides being escorted through the streets with torches and songs. In the marketplace, 2 men argued over the blood price for a dead man, and the elders sat in judgment. The second was a city at war. Armies besieged it, and an ambush was prepared near a river. Ares and Athena, forged in gold, led the soldiers. This was Achilles' reality. In another ring, he forged rural life, a field being plowed, a golden vineyard being harvested, a corn harvest, and a pasture where lions attacked a bull, while the shepherds and their dogs tried in vain to drive them away. In the final ring, he forged a ritual dance, young men and women in fine robes dancing in unison. And at the edge of it all, surrounding the entire world, he forged the great and mighty river Oceanus. The shield was a mirror of the life Achilles was sacrificing: peace, law, marriage, the harvest in the name of glory and vengeance. Hephaestus then made a breastplate brighter than fire, a helmet with a mane of pure gold and greaves of flexible tin. At dawn, Thetis descended from Olympus carrying the divine armor. She placed it at Achilles' feet. The metal shone with a heavenly light. The Myrmidons could not even look directly at it, so brilliant was its brilliance. But Achilles could. He took up his weapons, and his fury, once dark and internal, now took physical form. He was, once again, the killer of men. Jump forward in time. The battle is over. The champion's duel is over. Hector is dead. But for Achilles, revenge brought no peace, only a void that needed to be filled with more violence. Mourning for Patroclus was still an open, festering wound. Killing Hector was not enough. Achilles needed to annihilate him, erase his memory, humiliate his corpse. In an act of savagery that shocked mortals and gods alike, Achilles performed the darkest ritual of his fury. He used his knife to pierce Hector's tendons behind both heels. He threaded the leather thongs of his chariot through these holes, tying his enemy's body to the axle. He mounted his chariot, whipping his immortal horses, Xanthus and Balius. The body of Hector, the noble defender of Troy, was dragged through the dust. His head, once so beautiful, now banged against the stones, and his long, dark hair, once cared for by his mother and wife, was covered in bloody earth. This was no victory lap. It was an act of desecration, and the whole world witnessed it. From the impenetrable walls of Troy, his father, King Priam, watched. The old king cried out, begging his men to open the gates so he could run and throw himself at the feet of his son's murderer. "Let me plead with this savage man. Perhaps he will respect my age. Perhaps he will remember his own father." Beside him, Queen Hecuba, Hector's mother, tore her veils and screamed, exposing her breast, reminding her dead son, uselessly, of the breast that had suckled him. But the most tragic scene took place inside the palace. Hector's wife, Andromache, knew nothing. She was in her chambers preparing a hot bath for her husband, ordering her servants to heat the cauldron, for he would surely return tired from battle. It was then that she heard the screams from the walls. A cold foreboding seized her. She ran to the watchtower like a madwoman, her heart pounding. She reached the top just in time to see. She saw Achilles' chariot racing across the plain. She saw the dark object being dragged behind her. She saw it was her husband. Darkness filled her eyes and she fell backward, fainting, her hair ornaments scattering across the floor. Achilles' hatred was so great that he not only killed a man, he destroyed an entire family in a single instant. This act of desecration was so extreme that the gods on Olympus were divided, with Apollo, even though a Trojan ally, descending to magically protect Hector's body, preventing it from being torn apart or rotting. But Achilles, in his madness, did not stop. Day after day, he would drag Hector's body around Patroclus's tomb. He was no longer a hero. He was a grieving monster. And now we return to the moment that led to this, the final duel. Achilles' fury, now armed with divine weapons, was not a fighting force. It was a natural disaster. The next day, he publicly and coldly reconciled with Agamemnon, who returned Briseis to him along with vast gifts, none of which Achilles even glanced at. He had a single purpose. He led the charge, and what followed was his Hysteristeia, his supreme battle fury, a slaughter so vast it set the standard for the horror of war. He was a lion among cattle, and the Trojans fell before him. He wasn't just killing. He was taking revenge on Patroclus on every Trojan he encountered. His savagery was so extreme that he filled the Scamander River with so many corpses that the river god personified became enraged. The river rose in a massive flood to drown Achilles. But the hero, superhuman in his rage, fought the river itself until Hephaestus, the god of fire, descended to fight the water, creating a divine conflagration that forced the river to retreat. The Trojan army, broken and terrified, fled in panic back to the safety of their city. King Priam ordered the massive Scaean gates open to receive the torrent of his fleeing soldiers. Amid the chaos, all the Trojan warriors rushed inside except one, Hector. The defender of Troy, wearing the armor stolen from Achilles, remained outside the walls. He was paralyzed, not by fear, but by the weight of shame. It was he who, in a moment of pride, had ordered the Trojan army to camp on the plain the night before, ignoring Polydamas's advice to retreat to the city. This tactical decision led to the morning's disaster and, ultimately, the death of Patroclus. From the walls, his parents saw him. King Priam cried out, begging him to enter, not to face the monster that was Achilles, not to leave his father without his last and greatest son. Hecuba, his mother, wept, tearing her clothes and baring the breast that had suckled him, begging him to return to safety. But Hector was trapped by his own honor. He reasoned with himself. If he retreated now, he would face the scorn of his own people. He considered, briefly, laying down his arms and negotiating, offering the return of Helen and double the treasure. But he knew it was too late. The man approaching was no negotiator. He was a specter of vengeance. Then Achilles appeared, racing toward him, shining like the deadliest star of summer, Sirius. And in that moment, the courage of Hector, the bravest of mortals, broke. The reality of his opponent was overwhelming. He turned and ran. What followed was a terrifying spectacle for gods and men. Greece's greatest warrior pursuing Troy's greatest warrior. 3 times they raced around Troy's vast walls. Each time Hector attempted to approach the gates, Achilles intercepted him, forcing him back onto the plain. On Olympus, Zeus took up his golden scales. He placed Hector's fate on one scale and Achilles' on the other. Hector's fate sank, heavy, toward Hades. The goddess Athena, seeing that his fate was sealed, descended to earth. She appeared beside Hector, but in the form of his most trusted brother, Deiphobus. "Brother," she cried, sounding breathless, "let us stop and face this man together. I have come to help you." Hector's courage flooded back. He was no longer alone. He stopped running and turned to face his fate. He shouted to Achilles, proposing a pact of honor, that the victor would take the armor but return the body of the loser for burial. Achilles responded with pure hatred. "Do not speak to me of pacts, Hector. There are no agreements between lions and men, or between wolves and lambs." Achilles threw his spear. Hector ducked, and it sailed over him, plunging into the ground. Athena, invisible, snatched it away and returned it to Achilles. Hector, triumphant, threw his own. The spear struck the center of Hephaestus's divine shield. But the divine weapon did not yield, and the spear bounced harmlessly. Hector turned to Deiphobus, shouting for another spear, but there was no one there. Athena had vanished. In that moment of absolute silence, Hector understood the truth. The gods had abandoned him. He was doomed. He decided to die with glory. He drew his sword, the only weapon he had left, and rushed at Achilles like an eagle swooping down on its prey. But Achilles was waiting. He knew the armor Hector wore was his. He knew his only weakness. As Hector advanced, Achilles saw the small spot where the breastplate met the neck, a gap at the collarbone. He steadied his ash spear and drove it into that exact spot. The bronze point pierced the throat but missed the windpipe, allowing Hector his final words. "Fall into the dust," Hector whispered, begging for his body for ransom one last time. Achilles, standing over him, uttered the darkest answer of all. "Iliad, do not beg me, dog. I wish my own fury would drive me to cut off your flesh and eat it raw, for all you have done." Hector then used his dying breath for a prophecy. "Beware, Achilles, for the day of your death is near, at the Scaean gates, at the hands of Paris and Apollo." Then Hector's soul left his body and flew to Hades, lamenting his fate. Hector's death did not quench Achilles' fury, it only deepened it. He had killed Patroclus' murderer, but Patroclus remained dead. As we saw in the previous cliffhanger, Achilles committed the sacrilege of tying Hector's body to his chariot and dragging it through the dust, desecrating it before his family's eyes. He took the body back to the Greek camp and threw it beside Patroclus' funeral pyre, leaving it for the dogs and vultures. And for 12 days, his grief consumed him. Each morning at sunrise, he rebounded Hector's body and dragged it 3 times around his friend's tomb. On Olympus, the gods were horrified. This savagery was an offense to the cosmic order. Apollo, though an enemy of the Greeks, descended and magically protected Hector's body, preventing it from rotting or being torn apart. Finally, Zeus intervened. He summoned Thetis and gave her an order. Her son must stop this madness and accept a ransom for his body. At the same time, Zeus sent his messenger, Iris, to Priam. The message to the old king was incredible. He must gather a ransom worthy of a king and go, alone except for an elderly herald, to Achilles' tent in the heart of the enemy camp. In Troy, Priam's wife, Hecuba, became hysterical. She called him mad, said his heart was made of iron, that he was marching to certain death. She would rather mourn her son from afar than see her husband slaughtered as well. But Priam was possessed by divine determination. "My decision is made," he said. "If I must die in the tents of the Achaeans, so be it. But first, I will hold my son in my arms." He descended to his coffers and selected the ransom: 12 fine tunics, 12 cloaks, 10 talents of pure gold, bronze cauldrons, and a priceless golden cup. He loaded everything onto a wagon, dismissed his surviving sons, whom he called cowards in his grief, and rode off with his herald Idaeus into the night. The journey was a miracle. When they reached the Greek trenches, a young, noble figure appeared in the darkness. It was the god Hermes, the messenger, disguised as a young Myrmidon lieutenant. He told Priam that he was an aide to Achilles and that the god had sent him to guide him. With a tap of his staff, Hermes put the Greek sentries into a deep sleep and magically opened the massive gates of Achilles' compound. He led Priam to the door of the hero's own tent and, revealing his divinity, departed. Priam entered the tent. Achilles was there, sitting after a meal, his new armor piled in the corner. The old Trojan king walked silently across the packed earthen floor, unseen by his servants, and did the unthinkable. He knelt, clasped Achilles' knees in supplication, and kissed the man's hands. Not just any hands, but the terrible, man-killing hands that had slain so many of his sons. Achilles froze, shocked. Priam then spoke, and his words were the ones that finally broke the hero's fury. "Remember your own father, Achilles, equal to the gods. A man my age, on the painful threshold of old age. Perhaps he too is surrounded by enemies, with no one to save him. But he, at least, has the joy of knowing you are alive. But me? I, who fathered 50 sons, saw most of them dead. And best of all, my only defender, you killed. It is for him that I come, bringing infinite ransom. Respect the gods, Achilles, and pity me, remembering your father. For I am far more worthy of pity. I dare do what no other mortal man on earth has ever dared. Bring to my lips the hands of the man who killed my son." This image, the murdered man's father kissing the murderer's hands, broke the barrier of hatred. Achilles saw in Priam not his enemy, but a father. He saw the image of his own father, Peleus, whom he knew he would never see again. The fury dissolved into shared grief. Achilles took the old man's hands and gently pulled him away, and then both men wept. Priam wept for Hector, and Achilles wept for his father and for Patroclus. Humanity, lost in the savagery of war, returned to that tent. Achilles raised Priam, accepted the ransom, ordered Hector's body washed, anointed, and dressed in fine robes. He shared a meal with Priam, ensuring his safety. He then asked how many days Priam would need for the funeral. Priam asked for 11. Achilles gave his word, taking the old king's hand. For 11 days, then, the Achaeans will not fight. That night, Priam slept in his enemy's tent and left before dawn, taking Hector's body back to Troy. Iliad ends not with the fall of the city, but with the funeral of Hector the horse-tamer. The 11-day truce for Hector's funeral gave Troy a brief respite, but the end of mourning marked the renewal of war. The city's greatest defender was dead. Morale was shattered. But the war was not over yet. In the wake of Hector's death, powerful new allies, drawn by the promise of glory or by their long-held loyalty to Priam, arrived to reinforce the besieged city. The first of these reinforcements rekindled Troy's hope, Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons. She arrived with her contingent of fierce and beautiful warrior women, daughters of Ares, the god of war. Penthesilea wasn't there just for politics. She was fleeing a tragic past, having accidentally killed her sister Hippolyta in a hunting accident. She came to Troy seeking both glory in battle and the ritual purification that Priam could offer her. She was a force of nature, and her Aristeid attack was immediate and devastating. She and her Amazons fell upon the Greeks, and Penthesilea killed many. Her ferocity was such that she drove the Greek army back to their ships, and for a moment, it seemed as if a new Hector had emerged. Her ultimate goal was to face the man who had killed Hector, Achilles himself. Eventually, she found him. The duel between Achilles and Penthesilea was a battle of the Titans. But Achilles, with his divine armor and his fury now cold and focused, was unstoppable. He was the superior warrior. He overpowered her, and with a thrust of his spear, pierced her breastplate and mortally wounded her. It was then, according to the legend recorded in later poems of the epic cycle, that the tragedy was complete. As Achilles removed his fallen opponent's helmet, he saw her face for the first time. He was struck, not by a weapon, but by her stunning beauty. At the very moment his life ebbed away, Achilles fell in love with her. He was overcome by acute remorse for what he had done. As Achilles mourned over the body of the queen he had killed, one of the most despised Greek soldiers, Thersites, described by Homer as the ugliest and most cowardly man in the army, who constantly mocked his superiors, began to mock Achilles. He laughed and said that Achilles was crying because he had fallen in love with a dead war whore. And then, in a final act of contempt, Thersites thrust his spear into Penthesilea's eye. Achilles' fury, which had been calmed by Priam, exploded in an instant. He turned and with a single blow crushed Thersites' skull, killing him instantly. The second great ally to arrive was Memnon, the king of Ethiopia, a Greek term for the south or Africa. He was no mere mortal. Like Achilles, he was a demigod. His mother was Eos, the goddess of dawn, and his father was Tithonus, Priam's brother. He was, therefore, a cousin of the Trojans. Memnon arrived leading a vast army, his dark skin and beauty described as divine. He also had his own Orestia, proving himself a warrior almost equal to Hector. In his rage, he killed many Greeks, including Antilochus, the son of Nestor, the same young hero who had brought Achilles the news of Patroclus' death. Achilles, now forced to avenge another friend, sought out Memnon. The duel between the son of Thetis and the son of Eos was a battle of demigods. Their divine mothers watched from heaven, each fearing for her son. Zeus again weighed their fates. Memnon sank. Achilles found an opening and killed the Ethiopian king. Eos, the dawn, mourned her son's death so deeply that, according to Greek mythology, the morning dew is nothing more than the tears she sheds eternally for her son Memnon. With the death of Penthesilea and Memnon, Achilles had defeated every champion the world could send against him. He was at the absolute height of his glory, but also dangerously close to his own fate, prophesied by Hector. Achilles had become the very embodiment of war. Having avenged Patroclus, Antilochus, and so many others, he became an unstoppable force of death. With Memnon's death, Troy's last great ally was gone. The city was now at its lowest ebb, defended only by its own exhausted and terrified citizens. Achilles, in his fury, did not stop. He led the final charge, the attack Hector had predicted with his dying breath. In Aristea finally, he massacred the remaining Trojans on the plain and pursued them relentlessly to the city gates. For the first time in the war, the Greek army, led by Achilles, was about to storm the fortress. The hero looked like a god, his armor forged by Hephaestus shining with an unearthly light. He reached the Great Sion Gate, the main entry point into Troy. Hector's prophecy was about to be fulfilled. Paris, the prince who had started the war, stood on the walls near the gate. He was not a front-line warrior like his brother. He was an archer, but what he had in his favor was the alliance of the most powerful god protecting Troy, Apollo, the god of the silver bow. Apollo, who had watched Achilles slaughter his priests, desecrate Hector's body, and now threaten his sacred city, decided the hero's time was up. The god descended and stood beside Paris. The legend is told in various ways, each highlighting the nature of the hero's death. Some say Achilles was so consumed by rage that he failed to notice the archer above him. Others tell a more romantic and tragic story, that Achilles had fallen in love with Polyxena, Priam's daughter, and was lured to the gates under the pretense of negotiating their marriage, only to be ambushed. But the purest and most powerful version is the one on the battlefield. Paris, perhaps with trembling hands, drew the string of his bow. He didn't aim. He simply fired his arrow toward the force of nature that was about to destroy his home. It was then that Apollo intervened. The sun god, who is also the god of pestilence and fate, guided that arrow. He deflected it from Hephaestus's divine armor, which was impenetrable. He guided it downward, toward the only deadly point on the hero's entire body. The popular legend, most famous in Roman and later versions, claims it was the Achilles' heel. This was the spot where his mother, Thetis, had held him while dipping him in the river Styx, the only spot the immortal waters did not touch. In an older and perhaps more likely version, the arrow simply hit his ankle, a wound that, while incapacitating, would not have been fatal, unless the arrow was poisoned, or unless it was a divine arrow. Regardless of the mechanics, the result was the same. The world's greatest warrior, the man who fought rivers and slew demigods, stopped. He stumbled. The arrow of Paris, the man he most despised as an effeminate coward, was embedded in his heel. The poison, divine or mortal, surged through his veins. The demigod staggered and fell to the ground, dying not in a glorious duel, but by a lucky, opportunistic shot fired by the least worthy man on the battlefield. His death was a bitter irony that perfectly fulfilled destiny. He died young, at the height of his glory, in Troy, exactly as the prophecy had predicted. His fall caused an earthquake on the battlefield. A cry went up from both Greeks and Trojans. The axis of war had broken. Immediately, a fierce battle erupted over his body, as fierce as that waged by Patroclus. The giant Ajax, the second greatest Greek warrior, advanced, protecting the corpse with his 7-layered leather shield, while Odysseus and his men fought their way through and rescued the fallen hero. The death of Achilles plunged the Greek camp into the deepest mourning since the loss of Patroclus. For 17 days they mourned. Thetis and her sea nymphs ascended to sing a funeral lament, and the Muses descended to weep for the greatest hero of the age. After the funeral games held in his honor, a question of overwhelming political and military importance remained. Who would inherit his weapons? This was no trivial matter. The armor forged by Hephaestus was not just a piece of metal, it was a symbol. It was the cloak of the best of the Achaeans. Whoever wore it would be recognized as the new leader of the army, the successor to Achilles. Only 2 men had a legitimate claim. The first was Ajax the Great, son of Telamon and king of Salamis. His claim was based on brute force and tradition. He was the bulwark of the Achaeans, the strongest warrior after Achilles. More importantly, it was Ajax who, amid the rain of Trojan arrows and spears, had charged like a lion, protected Achilles' body with his tower shield, and physically carried him back to the ships, while Odysseus and Diomedes held back the Trojans. To Ajax, a man of simple thinking and straightforward martial honor, the armor belonged to the warrior who had saved it. The logic was unassailable. The second candidate was Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca. Odysseus's claim was based not on strength but on intelligence. He was not the strongest, but he was the most intelligent, the strategist who had held the army together through mutiny and desperation. If Ajax had saved Thebodiof Achilles, Odysseus would argue that he had saved Thealmoth the Greek army, again and again. He was the man who had unmasked Odysseus, recruited Achilles, stolen the Palladium, and conceived the horse plan. Where Ajax's strength failed against the walls, Odysseus's mind could find a way. The decision fell to the army leaders, or, in some versions, to a council of Trojan prisoners, who were asked which of the 2 men they feared most. Independent of the jury, the decision would be made through an oratory contest. It was a battle of brawn versus brain. Follow again. Studat spoke first. His speech, as described by the Roman poet Ovid, was harsh, direct, and powerful. He pointed to the ships. He spoke of his blood. He was Achilles' cousin. He mocked Odysseus, reminding everyone how the king of Ithaca had tried to feign madness to avoid war. He boasted of having faced Hector in single combat. His conclusion was simple: give these weapons to the man who stands between you and the enemy fire. Give them to the man who carried Achilles himself on his shoulders. Then Odysseus stood. And where Ajax used force, Odysseus used rhetoric. He was no soldier, he was a divine advocate. He charmed the jury. He admitted Ajax was strong, but reminded them that strength without mind is a danger. He turned each of Ajax's accusations into a virtue. Yes, he feigned madness, but he did so out of love for his family, something a brute like Ajax would not understand. Yes, Ajax carried the body, but it was Odysseus' strategy that enabled the rescue. He listed his accomplishments: Palamedes, Philoctetes, the Palladius. And then he struck the fatal blow. He looked at Hephaestus' shield, with its universe of stars, cities, and fields. What does this brute, he asked, pointing at Ajax, know about the constellations and the cities forged in this masterpiece? He can't even understand it. Give a clever man's armor to another clever man. Give it to the man who knows how to use it. The decision was unanimous. The assembly, perhaps tired of the brute force that had failed to overthrow Troy for 10 years, voted for cunning. Achilles' armor was awarded to Odysseus. This tension between brute force and intelligence is a theme that resonates to this day. We tend to celebrate the action hero, but often it's the quiet strategist who truly changes the world. Which one do you think truly deserved the weapons? The strength that saved them, or the mind that would win the war? Leave your opinion in the comments below. We want to hear your thoughts on this legendary contest. For Odysseus, victory was a confirmation of his intellectual superiority. For Ajax, it was the end of the world. It wasn't just a defeat, it was the negation of his own identity. Aizawa's, his honor, the central concept of his existence as a warrior, had been publicly destroyed. He, the man who had risked everything, who was Achilles' closest relative, who had carried him on his shoulders, had been passed over in favor of a babbler, a liar, a man he considered a coward. The decision was so shocking, so fundamentally wonked Ajax's worldview, which his mind, unable to process injustice, shattered. That night, Ajax's fury and grief turned into psychotic madness. In his mind, Odysseus and the leaders who had dishonored him, Agamemnon and Menelaus, were no longer his allies. They were his mortal enemies, worse than the Trojans. He swore they would pay for their insult in blood. He gripped his sword, determined to march into the camp and slaughter the Greek leaders in their sleep. He would have succeeded. He was an unstoppable force of fury, and nothing could have stopped him. But the goddess Athena, Odysseus' patron, intervened. She could not allow her protege and the Greek kings to be killed. But instead of calming Ajax, she chose a crueler punishment. She humiliated him. She cast a mist of illusion over his eyes. When Ajax invaded the Greek camp, he did not see the king's tents. He saw the flocks of sheep and cattle that the army kept for food. In his madness, he mistook the animals for the Greek leaders. He saw in one large ram the image of Odysseus, in another Agamemnon, in another Menelaus. What followed was a grotesque massacre. The greatest living Greek warrior, the bulwark of the Achaeans, spent the night slaughtering sheep. He cut, stabbed, and whipped them, shouting insults at Odysseus and Agamemnon as he did so. He seized the ram Odysseus and dragged him back to his tent. There, he tied him to a post and tortured him, whipping him with a whip, laughing madly, believing he was taking revenge on his rival. At dawn, Athena's mist dissipated. The madness receded, leaving behind the devastating reality. Ajax awoke, not surrounded by the bodies of his enemies, but amid a pool of blood and wool, surrounded by animal carcasses. The smell of death and his own madness overwhelmed him. The shame was total. He had not only been dishonored in a contest of words, he was now the laughingstock of the entire army. The man who had faced Hector had spent the night torturing a sheep. For a warrior whose identity was synonymous with strength and dignity, this was a humiliation from which there was no return. He took the sword Hector had given him years before, a gesture of mutual respect after the duel, a reminder of his former glory. He walked to a secluded part of the beach. There, he stuck the sword in the ground, point up. He spoke his last words, not to the Greeks, but to the world, cursing the sons of Atreus, Agamemnon, and Menelaus, and asking the gods of vengeance to hear him. Then, in a final act of unyielding pride, the man no enemy could ever defeat in battle, threw himself on his own blade. Ajax's suicide marked the end of the era of pure strength in the Greek army. From that moment on, the war would belong entirely to Odysseus, the man of the mind. The death of Ajax, following that of Achilles, was a crushing blow to Greek morale. The two pillars of the army's brute strength had fallen. 10 years of war, and the walls of Troy remained intact. Fury, siege, duels, nothing had worked. The army was on the verge of collapse, ready to abandon the expedition. It was in this vacuum of leadership and strategy that Odysseus, now in possession of Achilles' armor, proved his worth not as a warrior, but as a master of wits. Force had failed, it was time to turn to destiny. The seer Calchas was silent, so the Greeks needed a new source. In a daring raid, Odysseus and Diomedes captured Helenus, the Trojan prince, son of Priam and twin brother of the prophetess Cassandra. Helenus, like his sister, had the gift of sight. Under duress, or, as some suggest, of his own free will, for he hated Paris and knew the city was doomed, Helenus revealed why Troy would not fall. The city was protected not just by stone, but by a nexus of divine prophecies. For the Achaeans to win, 3 conditions, fatal, needed to be fulfilled. The first, the war could not be won without Hercules' divine bow. The second, Achilles' son, Neoptolemus, needed to join the battle. The third, which Odysseus had already secretly accomplished, was that the sacred statue of Athena, the Palladium, which protected the city, needed to be stolen from within the Trojan citadel. Odysseus acted immediately. The search for Neoptolemus was the easiest. He sailed to Cyrus, the island where Achilles had hidden as a woman, topic 11. There, he found Achilles' son with Princess Datimaya. The young man, also named Pyrrhus, was the image of his father, but was said to be even more brutal and ruthless. Seduced by the promise of glory and his father's inheritance, Neoptolemus agreed to go to Troy. The second task was infinitely more difficult and morally bleak. Hercules' bow was with the hero Philoctetes. Philoctetes had been one of Helen's original suitors, a great king, and the expedition's chief archer. But on the way to Troy 10 years earlier, he had been bitten on the foot by a venomous snake on the island of Crisa. The wound never healed. It festered, festering, and emitted such an unbearable stench that the army could neither eat nor sleep near him. His screams of agony echoed through the camp. In a pragmatic and cruel decision, led by Odysseus, the Greeks abandoned him on the deserted island of Lemnos. For 10 years, Philoctetes survived alone, a mythical Robinson Crusoe, feeding on Hercules' magical bow. His only companion, his grief, and his absolute hatred for Odysseus and the men who betrayed him. Now, Odysseus had to return and recruit the man he had destroyed. It was a mission of pure psychological manipulation. He took young Neoptolemus with him, hoping that the sight of Achilles' son might appeal to Philoctetes' former loyalty. When they found the hero in his fetid cave, he was more animal than man, crippled by grief. Philoctetes, upon seeing Odysseus, raised his bow, ready to kill him. Odysseus had to use all his cunning, lying, pleading, and manipulating, while Neoptolemus, still young and honorable, was horrified by the deception. In the end, it was the promise of a cure the sons of Asclepius, the army doctors, could heal his wound, and the divine intervention of Hercules himself, who appeared as a ghost that convinced Philoctetes to forgive, or at least postpone his revenge and join the cause. He was taken to Troy. The prophecies were nearly fulfilled. The arrival of the 2 new champions turned the tide of war. In Troy, Philoctetes finally had his wound healed by Machaon, the army doctor. Restored, his first act was revenge. He went into battle, his divine bow whirring for the first time in 10 years, and he sought a specific target. He saw Paris, the prince, with his own bow, the man who had killed Achilles. But Paris's bow, guided by Apollo, was no match for Hercules' bow, guided by fate. Philoctetes loosed one of Hercules' arrows, dipped in the deadly venom of the Lernaean Hydra. The arrow struck Paris. The man who had started the war for the promise of beauty fell, dying slowly in agony, the Hydra's venom burning through his veins. At the same time, Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, proved himself worthy of his name, leading brutal attacks against the Trojans. With Paris dead and the prophecies fulfilled, the Greeks launched an all-out assault. And yet the city did not fall. The walls of Troy, the masterpiece of Apollo and Poseidon, still stood. The Greeks had killed the instigator of war, had fulfilled the gods' checklist, had stolen the city's protective statue, and yet the gates remained closed. Brute force had failed. Prophesized force had failed. The 10-year stalemate continued. It was in this moment of final frustration that Putatius's cunning intelligence conceived the final solution. The idea that would change the meaning of the word present forever. If they could not bring down the walls of strength, they would have to make the Trojans themselves open them by mistake. The plan was radical, bordering on madness, but psychologically brilliant. The Greeks would build an idol, a horse. They would build it from pine wood from Mount Ida, sacred to the Trojans. It would be a colossal offering to the goddess both sides revered, but whom the Greeks had offended by stealing the Palladium, Athena. Odysseus presented the plan to the army's master craftsman, Epius. The horse had to be hollow. It had to be large enough to house the elite Greek warriors, Odysseus, Menelaus, Diomedes, the young Neoptolemus, but most importantly, it had to besso. Bigthight could not pass through the gates of Troy. This was the genius of the trap. The second part of the plan was even more daring. The Greek army would burn its own camp, load its ships, and set sail. They would pretend to give up. They would sail west but hide behind the neighboring island of Tenedos, out of sight of Troy, and wait for the signal. One man would have to be left behind, a volunteer for a suicide mission, to be captured by the Trojans and sell the lie. The man chosen was Sinon, a relative of Odysseus and a master of deception. Sinon was instructed in his story. He was a deserter, a man Odysseus hated, and who had been chosen as a human sacrifice to ensure favorable winds for the Greeks' return journey. He would escape and tell the Trojans the lie about the horse. The greatest invasion in history would not be a battle. It would be an intelligence operation. The fate of 1,000 ships and 100,000 men now rested on the skill of one man and the credulity of an exhausted enemy. The next morning, the watchmen on the walls of Troy rubbed their eyes in disbelief. The impossible had happened. The beach was empty. The vast Greek camp, that city of barracks that had been a scar on their landscape for 10 years, was gone. All that remained were the smoldering ashes of their fires, and in the center of the desolate plain, an object that defied comprehension, a wooden horse of titanic proportions, silently staring at the city gates. The gates opened. For the first time in a decade, the citizens of Troy, men, women, and children, rushed onto the beach. They touched the sand where Achilles had bound Hector, saw the ruins of Agamemnon's tent. The euphoria was delirious. The war was over. They had won. The greatest alliance in history had been defeated by their walls and their perseverance. But the horse remained, a silent enigma. What to do with it? Immediately, a heated debate began. Diomedes, one of the Trojan elders, perhaps in collusion with the Greeks, was the first to suggest, "Bring him in. He's a trophy, an offering to Athena. We should place him in the citadel to celebrate our victory." But others, led by Capys, were suspicious. "It's a trap," they argued. "It's an invention of Odysseus's. Burn him where he lies, or push him into the sea. Or at least, let's cut him open and see what's inside his belly." The crowd was divided, vibrating between the joy of victory and the residual fear of their enemies. It was then that the voice of Trojan reason tried to intervene. Locoon, the priest of Poseidon or Apollo in some versions, rushed down from the citadel, furious at his people's naivete. He was not in his priestly robes, but armed like a warrior. "Wretched Trojans," he shouted. "What madness is this? Do you truly believe the enemy has departed? Do you think any gift from the Daunians Greeks can be free from deception? Do you know Odysseus so little? Either there are warriors hidden within this wood, or it is a war machine built to spy on our homes and attack from above. Do not trust the horse, Trojans." To prove his point, Laocoon summoned all his strength and hurled his massive spear at the horse's flank. The wood rumbled. The hollow belly vibrated with the impact. Some say a muffled groan or the clang of armor echoed from within, but the Trojans, in their excitement, failed to notice. Laocoon then uttered the line history would never forget, whatever it is. "I fear the Daunians and those bearing gifts. Whatever it is, I fear the Greeks, even when they bring gifts." His warning was powerful. The crowd wavered, Laocoon's argument nearly winning the day. But Odysseus's trap had a second phase. Just as suspicion was at its height, Trojan shepherds appeared, dragging a man they had found hiding in the reeds. The man was bound, weeping, looking the picture of despair. It was Sinon. The final piece of Odysseus's puzzle was in place. He was dragged before King Priam and began his rehearsed speech. He told his story of Odysseus's betrayal, of being selected for sacrifice. The story, full of tears and believable details, won Priam's sympathy. Then Priam asked about the horse. Sinon, now safe, revealed the main lie. It is an offering to Athena, he explained, to appease the goddess for the desecration of her temple when Odysseus stole the Palladium. Odysseus deliberately built it so large that you could not pass it through the gates. For the oracle said that if the horse were destroyed, Athena's wrath would fall on Troy. But if you brought it into your city, the goddess's protection would pass to you, and one day Troy would sail to Greece and conquer Mycenae. This was the genius of the lie. It transformed the Trojans' fear into pride and greed. Now they had to bring him in. Laocoon's warning based on logic was now fighting a lie based on vanity. This moment of decision is one of the most tragic in history. How many times in our own lives have we ignored a logical warning in favor of a lie that makes us feel good? The story of Laocoon teaches us to be wary of gifts that are too good to be true. If you value these lessons that echo from history, please like the channel to support the channel and share this video. Knowledge of history is our best defense against repeating its mistakes. Just as Laocoon's logic and Sinon's manipulation were locked in a battle for Troy's soul, the gods who had bet on the city's downfall decided to intervene. The scales of persuasion were dangerously balanced. Laocoon's spear, vibrating in the horse's hollow flank, was an act of skepticism that threatened to destroy Odysseus's masterpiece. For Sinon's lie to succeed, Laocoon's warning needed to be not only ignored, but discredited in spectacular and terrifying fashion. The city's fate was sealed by a horror that rose from the sea. Laocoon, having delivered his warning, returned to his priestly duty. He stood on the beach near an altar, preparing to sacrifice a magnificent bull to his god, Poseidon. His 2 young sons assisted him. Suddenly, the crowd on the beach shouted and pointed toward the sea. From the direction of Tenedos, the island where the Greek fleet was hidden, 2 sea serpents of colossal size emerged from the waters. Virgil's description, in Aeneas, the one that echoes through the ages, their heads and chests rose above the waves, their blood-red crests dripping with venom, their eyes bloodshot with fire. They swam toward the shore, their massive bodies leaving a trail of hissing foam. The terrified crowd fled. The serpents ignored the bull on the altar. They had a target ordained by the gods. They slithered straight toward Laocoon's 2 sons. They wrapped their coils around them, their muscular bodies tightening like viscuses. The children screamed, a piercing agony that cut through the seaside air. Laocoon, hearing his sons' screams, dropped his sacrificial knife and rushed to their aid, clutching his spear, the very instrument he had dared to hurl at the horse. But he was no match for divine power. When he tried to uncoil the creatures from his sons, the serpents turned on him. They grabbed him. What followed was the image immortalized in the famous marble statue, the priest and his 2 sons, entwined in an impossible knot of muscle and scales. The serpents bit Laocoon, their teeth injecting a lethal venom. Virgil describes the priest's screams not as human, but as the bellow of a bull fleeing the altar, a profound animal agony. The priest, the father, the man of reason, was crushed and poised, dying in agony along with his sons at the foot of the altar he served. But the horror didn't end there. After completing their task, the 2 serpents didn't disappear. They slithered along the beach, past the paralyzed Trojan crowd, up the hill into the city and into the citadel. They went directly to the temple of Athena, the goddess Sinon had just invoked, and coiled, hissing, at the foot of the goddess's statue. For the Trojans, exhausted by 10 years of war and desperate to believe in victory, their interpretation of this event was immediately and fatally flawed. They didn't see it as the gods killed the man who spoke the truth. They saw it as the gods punished the man who sinned. Laocoon had dared to hurl his spear at Athena's sacred offering, and Athena, in her fury, had sent the serpents to punish his sacrilege. Sinon's lie was now divinely confirmed. The horse was, indeed, sacred. Laocoon's warning was blasphemy. The debate was over. Reason was dead, along with its greatest defender. Laocoon's death broke the last barrier of suspicion. The crowd, now united in religious fervor and fearful of similar divine punishment, rushed to the horse. King Priam's order was given: bring the offering to the city, to the temple of Athena. But Odysseus had planned even this. The horse was deliberately too large to pass through the Scaean gates. In their frenzy of celebration and fear, the Trojans committed the ultimate act of self-destruction. They took pickaxes and crowbars and tore down a section of their own wall. The impenetrable walls, which had withstood Achilles and a decade of siege, were torn down by the Trojans themselves to accommodate the instrument of their downfall. They placed the horse on rollers, tied ropes, and pulled it into the city in a triumphal procession. Children danced, singers sang hymns, and everyone touched the sacred wood. 4 times it stopped in the gap of the gate, and 4 times the sound of metal clashing against metal came from within. The sound of panicked heroes clashing, but the loud music of the celebration drowned out the warning. The prophetess Cassandra, Hector's sister, ran through the streets, her hair flowing loose, her eyes wide with horror. She grabbed her horse, shouting to them, "There are armed men inside, fire and death are in their womb." But her curse, imposed by Apollo, remained. She spoke the truth, but no one would ever believe her. They called her mad and dragged her back, locking her in her chambers. The city was plunged into the greatest celebration in its history. The war was over. Wine flowed freely. Sentry posts were abandoned. Exhausted, relieved, and completely drunk, Troy fell asleep. In the darkness of the dead of night, when sleep was deepest, Odysseus's plan reached its final stage. Sinon, now a hero in Troy, crept out and lit a signal fire from the top of the wall, a beacon for the Greek fleet waiting at Tenedos. At the same time, he opened the secret hatch in the horse's belly. The elite of Greece descended silently on a rope: Odysseus, Menelaus, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, the brutal son of Achilles. They killed the sleepy guards at the inner gates and pried open the massive bars. The Greek fleet, having rowed back in the darkness, landed its main army, which entered the now defenseless city. What followed was not a battle, it was a massacre. The Greeks, filled with 10 years of pent-up fury and the savagery that war breeds, gave no quarter. They stormed homes, killing men in their beds, dragging women from their bedrooms. The city awoke to a nightmare of fire and screams. But the savagery of victory was marred by acts of hubris and sacrilege that would seal the fate of the victors themselves. The goddess Athena, who had aided the Greeks, was the first to be offended. Cassandra fled to the temple of Athena, the same temple for which the horse was destined. She clung to the wooden statue of the goddess, seeking divine protection. The hero Ajax the Lesser, not the one who killed himself, a quick but arrogant man, found her there. Blinded by lust, he ignored her. When she wouldn't release the statue, he forcibly dragged her away, knocking it over in the process, and, according to most accounts, raped her on the sacred temple floor. This act of desecration was so extreme that the statue of Athena itself is said to have looked up to the heavens in horror. Elsewhere, the aged King Priam, who had so moved Achilles, donned his armor for the last time. He was found at the family altar in the courtyard of his burning palace. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, found him there, having just killed Priam's son Peleus before his father's eyes. Priam, helpless, threw his spear weakly at the young man. Neoptolemus, lacking his father's compassion, mocked him, grabbed the old king by the hair, and dragged him through his own son's blood to the altar. And there he killed him, an unholy sacrifice in a sacred place. The final fate was the coldest. Odysseus, in his ruthless logic, declared that as long as an heir of Hector lived, Troy could rise again. And so, Hector's infant son, Astyanax, was torn from the arms of his mother, Andromache. The baby was taken to the top of the walls of Troy, the same walls his father had defended for so long, and thrown to his death on the rocks below. By dawn, Troy was a smoking ruin. The men were dead. The women Hecuba, Andromache, and Helen herself, now reclaimed by Menelaus, were chained as slaves, the victor's ultimate prize. The Greeks had won. The city of Troy was nothing but broken stone and ash. The gold was melted down, the temples desecrated, and the royal women were distributed like cattle. With their ships overloaded with treasure and slaves, the Achaean armies, arrogant in their total victory, prepared for the short voyage home. They expected parades and glory, but they had forgotten a fundamental rule of their own universe: the gods watch. The victory had been so brutal, the sack so full of sacrilege, that the very gods who had ensured their victory now turned against them. The rape of Cassandra in the temple of Athena, the murder of Priam at the altar, the infanticide of Astyanax. These were not acts of war. They were crimes against the cosmos, and the cosmos would demand payment. The journey home, then Nostoi, would be, for many, a more deadly ordeal than the war itself. Athena, whose protection had been so crucial, was now consumed with fury against Ajax the Lesser and the entire army that tolerated his crime. She went to her uncle, Poseidon, the god of the seas, who already hated the Greeks for other reasons, and called for a storm. While the Greek fleet was out at sea, a supernatural storm struck, a fury of winds and waves that shattered the united armada. Ships were dashed against rocks, and men who had survived 10 years of war drowned just days from home. The fate of Ajax the Lesser was exemplary. His ship was struck by Athena's lightning bolt. He survived by clinging to a rock, and in a final act of hubris, he shouted that not even the gods could kill him against his will. Poseidon, hearing this arrogance, raised his trident and split the rock in two, and Ajax was swallowed by the sea. The fate of Agamemnon, the king of kings, was most ironic. He had a quick journey home, arriving in Mycenae as a triumphant conqueror. He brought with him his greatest prize, the prophetess Cassandra, but he didn't know he was walking into a trap he'd been preparing for 10 years. His wife, Clytemnestra, had never forgiven him for sacrificing their daughter, Iphigenia, at Aulus Topic 13. While he was away, she took a lover, Aegisthus Agamemnon's cousin and heir to a vengeful branch of the family. Clytemnestra greeted her husband with false smiles, rolling out a red carpet, an act of hubris, making him walk like a god and inviting him to a hot bath. While Agamemnon lay in the bath, unarmed and vulnerable, Clytemnestra trapped him in a cloth net and hacked him to death with an axe. Cassandra, who foresaw everything in horrific detail, was killed soon after. The great leader of the expedition died not in battle, but slaughtered like an animal by his own wife. Menelaus, who had retrieved Helen, was caught in the same storm and blown off course. He and Helen wandered the seas for 7 long years, being driven as far as Egypt before they could perform the proper sacrifices and finally return to Sparta. And of course, there was Odysseus. Because of his arrogance, his role in the desecration of the temples, and later for blinding Poseidon's son, he was cursed not to return home for another 10 years. His journey back, Odyssey, would lead him to face monsters, gods, sirens, and witches. He would lose all his ships, all his men, and, as the oracle had predicted, he would return to Ithaca alone, disguised as a beggar, to find his home invaded by suitors. The victory at Troy was not an end, but the beginning of a new era of suffering. For the Greeks, the lesson was clear. The manner of victory matters as much as the victory itself. The fire at Troy eventually died out. The royal women were taken into slavery. The heroes departed on their cursed journeys. In Priam city, the jewel of the Aegean, fell silent. The Troy that archaeologists today call VIIA is, in fact, a layer of ash and rubble, marked by a violent destruction around 1180 BC. It is the archaeological endpoint of a real conflict. But the Greek victory was the most empty in history. The victors gained a dead world. The Trojan War was not the heroic event that ushered in a new era. It was the last convulsive spasm of a dying era. The Mycenaean civilization, the palace culture of Agamemnon and Odysseus, did not survive its own victory. Witnessed what the returns describe at the micro level. Kings murdered Agamemnon. Kingdoms invaded Odysseus. Heroes wandering aimlessly Menelaus was happening at the macro level. War was likely the ultimate cause of the ruin, a colossal effort that shattered the palace economy. The returning kings found not glory, but chaos. Within decades of the traditional date of the fall of Troy, the entire Mycenaean system collapsed. Mycenae, rich in gold, was sacked and burned. Pylos, the palace of the wise Nestor, was burned so fiercely that its linear B-clay tablets, the palace inventory records, were fired like pottery, preserving for us the last desperate records of centuries posted on the coast, waiting for an enemy coming from the sea. This was not an isolated event. It was a civilizational collapse on a Mediterranean scale. Within 50 years, all the great Bronze Age powers that had defined the world of Troy Topic 1 disappeared. The Hittite Empire, Troy's overlord, evaporated from history. The great trading cities of the Levant, such as Ugarit, were reduced to ashes. Egypt, though it survived, was permanently weakened, fighting for its life against a mysterious confederation of invaders they called the Sea Peoples. Historians call this period the Bronze Age collapse. The causes are a debated mystery, a perfect storm of earthquakes, prolonged droughts that caused widespread famine, and, most famously, these sea peoples, mysterious invaders who may have included the Achaeans Greeks themselves, who, having destroyed Troy, may have continued their piratical raids until the system that sustained them collapsed in on itself. The Trojan War itself may be merely the poetic memory of one such sea people's attack, a brutal sack of a strategic city, immortalized in poetry. For Greece, the result was Greek Dark Ages civilization regressed 1,000 years almost overnight. The great Cyclopean walls stood empty, haunted. The population plummeted by up to 90%. Complex art disappeared. International trade ceased. And most crucial of all, writing was lost. Linear B, the script of the Mycenaean palaces, vanished completely. Greek society became illiterate for over 400 years. The world of heroes, of Agamemnon, Achilles, and Odysseus, gave way not to an empire, but to a vacuum. The final irony and the true legacy of the war is that although material civilization has died, his story served. During the 4 centuries of illiteracy, while people lived in mud huts in the shadow of the ruins of their ancestors' palaces, the bards Theodoi continued to sing. They sang of the glory of a lost age, of a time when men were giants and fought for a divine queen before impenetrable walls. The myth survived the Dark Ages. And then, around 750 BC, when the Greeks rediscovered writing this time, the Phoenician alphabet, a blind poet named Homer, took these fragments of oral memory and transformed them into the 2 greatest works of Western literature. The true legacy of the Trojan War was not political change, for everyone lost, but the creation of Iliad and the Odyssey. This story has survived the collapse of empires, a dark age, and millennia of change, and has reached you today. If you believe these stories are more than just myths, but rather echoes of our distant past that still have the power to teach us about ambition, rage, and the cost of war, subscribe to the channel. We want to continue telling these great stories. Which part of this journey shocked you most? The cunning of the horse, or the tragedy of the collapse that followed? Leave your final thoughts in the comments and tell us where you followed this epic saga from.